The study of revolutions, civil wars, and protest politics is central to the discipline of political science. Events like these, more than any others, reveal the true stakes of political action in their starkest form. The questions of who rules and why, and what makes one government legitimate and another an outlaw, and which classes control the state and in whose interests, are inescapable in conditions of revolutionary upheaval. We study these phenomena jointly because they so often appear together. Virtually all major revolutions have provoked civil war, while many civil wars carry with them the potential to develop into episodes of revolutionary change. Since democratic and authoritarian states are typically keen to avoid any sort of lurch into the disaster of civil war or revolution, the dynamics of protest politics become extremely important for studying how political conflicts develop in conditions that could evolve toward revolution, but do not necessarily do so. We might understand these three concepts, contentious politics, civil war, and revolution, as a kind of pyramid. The broad base is contentious politics, which appears in all sorts of countries and regime types under a variety of conditions. Modern American politics, as they have been in the past, are an arena of contentious politics. The idea behind contentious politics is that, in the normal course of affairs, most political forces within a reasonably representative regime conduct politics as a kind of game. There are rules for play and accepted, enforced standards for judging victory and defeat. The assumption is that any political disputes that arise can be dealt with according to the rules of the game, in ways that do not alienate the losers or embolden the winners. In this scenario, a political defeat for a given group does not threaten their status in society or their ability to continue playing the game of politics. After all, if the Mets blow a 5-run lead in the bottom of the ninth, they're still allowed to play the next game. They might even win. In the best case scenario, politics operates according to what game theorists call a positive sum game. In games like this, it is possible for more than one team to win. A coalition of teams could share the victory. Most importantly, positive sum games can yield winners, but not losers. One can win a political battle without someone else necessarily losing it. But what happens when this harmony breaks down? What happens when political groups begin making political demands that interfere with the interests of another group, in such a way that victory for one side can only mean defeat for another? A situation of conflicting interests, in which one interest must yield to the other, is described as contentious, and the politics that govern this struggle is contentious politics. For game theorists, the world of contentious politics is the world of the zero-sum game, in which the winner's gain comes directly from the loser's loss. The stakes are high in zero-sum games, and accordingly, the rules in effect are harsher and more unforgiving. No matter what kinds of social groups are contending with each other, the state is always the focus of their struggle. Since contentious politics involves pressing one group's claims to the disadvantage of another's, the state must be involved, since the state has the power to wield the violence and make the laws that regulate political interests in the first place. Contentious politics can involve seeking the aid and protection of the state, using the state's power against one's rivals, or agitating for a direct share in state power. One way or another, the role of the state is central to this kind of politics. Contentious politics is mass politics, and in modern times is typically waged by what we call social movements. Social movements are the collective expression of a set of demands, addressed to the state by a group or a coalition of groups. Just how these groups act is determined by the particular cultural and political traditions from which they emerge, which means that contentious politics is practiced in a tremendous variety around the world. The tactics and strategies different groups use, what scholars call a repertoire of contention, are shaped by history and experience. Consider the iconic 20th century American social movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a social movement for black civil and political equality, in which combinations of citizens demanded that the state extend the equal protection of the law to all citizens regardless of race. This movement was in turn resisted by a white majority that benefited from the status quo and reacted in defense of its privileges. Now, the basic demand for equal interracial democracy is as old as the Civil War. But for decades, the Jim Crow regime, with the support of the federal government, prevented this development. Why did Jim Crow succeed for as long as it did? And why was it destroyed when it was? Why was the Civil Rights Act of 1875 defeated, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed? As with so much in politics, timing is everything. One argument as to why the civil rights movement took off when it did is that only in the late 1940s did you have a set of conditions favorable to successful contentious politics. These aren't conditions that people can consciously shape all on their own. They're like the weather. You can't control it, you just have to adapt to it. It's well known that Southern black churches provided the community network that sustained the civil rights movement through severe repression. All successful social movements rely on some kind of framework for enduring a long political struggle, often one or another kinds of ideological commitment. The churches provided a source of leadership, organization, and communication that helped compensate for the suppression of black political life in the South. But these churches were arguably as strong in 1910 as they were in 1960, so why was change so long in coming? By the late 1940s, nearly 20 years of liberal political reform had brought the cause of civil rights into the Democratic Party, which made room for a level of black political participation not seen since Reconstruction. Also, millions of black servicemen returned from World War II, depicted as a democratic crusade against fascism, unwilling to resume lives without the rights and dignity they had experienced as soldiers. These developments forced open a political space in which black political organizers could assert themselves and encourage a movement to demand wholesale change. Suddenly, it was possible to mobilize collective action through existing social networks and direct it toward long desired political goals. These conditions by no means guaranteed the success of the civil rights movement, they just made it possible. It took years of struggle in which different forms of contention were tried and tested, elevated, or discarded. The movement's commitment to nonviolence further determined the forms it would take, since violent resistance was ruled out. The still famous protest tactics of the era remain common in today's repertoires of contention. After all, it's not a big conceptual leap from sitting in at a segregated lunch counter to occupying Wall Street. Contentious politics are a universal aspect of political life, though their intensity and power may rise and fall over time. They appear in democracies and autocracies, imperial powers and colonial possessions. They appear among and between social classes and racial castes, from cities to villages. One could argue that since the 2008 financial crisis, it's been the dominant mode of politics in much of the world. Think of Occupy Wall Street or the Indignados, the Arab Spring, and the Hong Kong democracy movement. There are dozens more examples, but I would argue that the politics of the 2010s were contentious in large part because the social forces involved understood politics to be a zero-sum game. For me to win, my enemy must lose. My enemy can only win if I lose. From these assumptions comes the pattern of escalating confrontation that can take contentious politics into the far more turbulent realm of civil war and revolution. So we treat contentious politics as the base of our pyramid, because it is by far the more widespread phenomenon when compared to civil war or revolution. But episodes of contentious politics carry within them the potential for expanded conflict. Just as the success or failure of a contentious movement depends upon certain conditions outside of our direct control, the possibility for contentious politics exploding into something more severe is also determined by impersonal conditions. Not all civil wars are or become revolutions, but virtually all major revolutions are accompanied by episodes of civil war. So what is a civil war? They take many forms, but all of them are centered on an armed challenge to the authority of the state, which results in a lapse of the state's monopoly on violence and a descent into general social conflict. In a civil war, the state's sovereignty is shattered, and armed competitors arise trying to establish their own undeniable authority. The state may recover and reassert itself, or it might be so thoroughly wrecked that a new state under new authorities takes its place. Or perhaps the state might strike a deal with one rival to suppress another, and so hammer out a new kind of power arrangement. Historically, there have been many possible outcomes. Consider two of the longest ongoing civil wars of our time, in Syria and Afghanistan. In 2011, Syria's authoritarian regime, headed by the Assad family, faced a major popular uprising as part of the Arab Spring. Mass protests by the country's Sunni Muslim majority demanded the overthrow of the Assad regime, which was dominated by members of the Alawite religious minority. The regime responded with brutal violence, fracturing all the key institutions of the state, especially the army. Once soldiers began to defect in large numbers to the protesters, it was clear that the state was facing an existential threat. The breakdown in state control allowed factions to align themselves into pro and anti-regime coalitions. But since neither side was strong enough on its own to defeat the other, fighting dragged on inconclusively. And as it did, it spread chaos and instability, which necessarily affected Syria's neighbors. And as in so many civil wars, this invited foreign intervention. Russian, Turkish, American, and Iranian weapons and soldiers flooded the country. In fact, Assad's eventual victory in the war depended upon Syria's long-standing alliance with Russia and Iran, who provided the weapons and manpower to overcome rebel resistance. The rebels, in turn, could not secure the same level of support from the United States or European countries, relying on intermittent aid that was sufficient to keep the war going, but not sufficient to secure a rebel victory. Moreover, the Assad regime adroitly exploited tensions within Syrian society to keep the regime afloat. As an Alawite, Assad presented his government as the only protector of Syria's minorities from the supposed radicalism of the Sunni Muslim majority. This argument helped keep the country's powerful Christian, Shia, and Druze minorities on the government side. Meanwhile, the regime covertly aided jihadist rebels fighting against them, arguing that the government's brutal crackdown on dissidents was in fact just another front in the war on terror. Indeed, the early secular, democratic opposition to Assad was either massacred or exiled, and the regime defined all of its enemies as terrorists in order to justify unrestrained violence against them. While the fighting has not yet ended, it seems clear that Assad's regime will survive, and will then be faced with the extraordinarily difficult task of reasserting state sovereignty after a long and ugly civil war. Failure here could leave Syria in a condition resembling Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been locked in a cycle of civil wars that began in 1979. The American war in Afghanistan, at 19 years old, the country's longest ever war, is just one episode in a much larger conflict. Afghanistan is an isolated country that has nevertheless been at the center of Asian imperial politics since the mid-19th century, when the British and Russians fought for control of the region. Afghanistan went through a turbulent period of modernization after World War II, leading to a series of revolts against the monarchy, and finally a Communist Party coup that seized control of the government in 1979. Uprisings against the unpopular regime spread rapidly, prompting the Soviet Union to invade the country and setting off a civil war that is still going on. The Soviet war in Afghanistan coincided with a final period of Cold War tension throughout the 1980s. Determined to make Afghanistan the Russians' Vietnam, the United States lavished money and weapons on the Mujahideen, rural insurgents who resisted the Soviets and their allied Afghan government as unacceptably secular and modern. In the 1980s, these rebels were often portrayed as romantic heroes, whom Americans should support in their struggle for freedom. In every Afghan insurgent army, there might be a potential Muslim George Washington eagerly awaiting American help. This turned out not to be the case, and in fact, the generous American encouragement of the Afghan resistance is now a classic example of blowback, the catastrophic, unforeseen consequences of imperial political action. In any event, the Soviets failed to win the war, and in fact, the drain of the conflict helped speed the collapse of the USSR. As the Cold War ended, most people promptly forgot about Afghanistan, and the withdrawal of foreign money and weapons meant that the warring factions now lacked the ability to deliver a knockout, war-winning blow. A period of general breakdown in the 1990s ended when the Taliban seized most of the country and enforced an uneasy truce in much of the territory under their control. The Taliban were a product of civil war, an intensely religious militia whose commitment to a radical form of Salafism gave them the discipline and coherence to defeat rival factions and impose a measure of order in its territory. The Taliban, in effect, rebuilt a form of the Afghan state from the ground up, since there was effectively no functioning state institutions left by the time of the Soviet withdrawal. The Taliban's religious commitments won it funding from wealthy sympathizers in the Gulf states, not least the old Mujahideen Osama bin Laden, who cited his Al Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan. The 9/11 attacks and the American invasion destroyed the Taliban state, but not the Taliban themselves. 19 years later, the Taliban carry on their civil war against an American-backed state in Kabul that likely would not survive without constant infusions of American money, weapons, and troops. Contentious politics and civil wars have been present in human politics throughout recorded history. Revolutions have too, but in the modern era they have taken on a new and unique importance in shaping political life, so much so that they can be understood as the central political events of modernity. What these revolutions consist of and how they develop will be the subject of our next lecture.